I don't think I said good morning earlier. Good morning, everyone. To the last part of our series, In the Beginning. And today we're thinking of this fabulous story of this person called Joseph. And we're going to cover about 13 chapters of Genesis today. I'm going to have a bit of help along the way. But it's interesting, the Joseph story, at least the way it's come up in the Bible, at the beginning of chapter 37, this is the account of Jacob's family line. It's almost saying this is Jacob's story. So though it's Joseph's story, it's Jacob's story too. And as we'll see, it is also our story. So, how are we going to do this? How are we going to cover the story of Joseph? Well, it starts like this. What? Fine example of a family man. I mean, for those of you who were here last week, although he does a good job at the end, and they're kind of reunited with his brother, fine example of a family man is not probably what we will be talking about when it comes to Jacob. The guy who had conned his dad, his mum was involved in it, but conned his brother, all of that breakdown, and we'll see the story of Joseph. But we have seen throughout Genesis so far people making bad decisions, people making the wrong choice, and God still working through it. We continue the story. Joseph's mother, she was quite my favourite wife. So this starts a whole area of problems for this family. Firstly, multiple wives and then wives' servants. So there was multiple mothers to the different brothers. But one is seen as a favourite. So instantly you've got all these young people thinking, well, he thinks my mum's not as good as that person's mum. And so this insecurity is sown and bitterness is sown. And it just gets worse. In fact, this bitterness grew into, the Bible uses where they said these brothers hated him. They hated him because of this bias. They saw themselves feeling inferior to Joseph. It says they have no kind word to say about him. And then Joseph has these different dreams. And so as he has this dream that he shares in a clearly pompous way, which is captured quite well in the musical, it sows even greater hatred, this idea for the brothers that they are going to have to bow down to this person that they despise. And then Joseph has another dream about the stars, 11 sort of stars, and the moon and the sun, and he says, they'll all be bowing down to me. And at that point, Jacob kind of steps in and says, Joseph, what on earth do you think you're doing, basically? Because at that point, Rachel had died, and so his venting basically then his grief at him, thinking, what are you doing talking about your mother bowing to you? And so the brothers' hatred and despising leads them to a scene when he's not originally with them, Joseph isn't with them. They're all doing some shepherding, and Jacob says, go off and see your brothers. What's kind of lost in the musical a little bit is while this plan is being hatched, one of the brothers, Reuben, decides, actually what I'm going to do is wait from the pit and then I'll go and save him later. Except by the time later comes, his brothers have sold him into slavery. And then they have to hatch this plan to their father that their brother has been mauled by kind of some animal. And their hatred has reached this point where they have sold their brother, they have told this lie to their father. And Joseph ends up in Egypt working for a guy called Potiphar, whose wife then makes a move on him. And Joseph basically says, how could I do such a wicked thing against God? Maybe a hint, he started to think beyond himself. But when he resists her moves, she screams and cries, rape. And Joseph is thrown in jail. In jail, God is with Joseph. And eventually, a baker and a cupbearer come to him. So Joseph says to them, interpretations of dreams belong to God. And then he says to the cupbearer, you will go free. And to the baker, you're about to be executed. And to the cupbearer who goes free, he says, remember me. And then the cupbearer forgets. Until 2 years later, Pharaoh has some dreams. And he's really like, oh, what am I going to do with these dreams? And the cupbearer says, oh, I remember a guy when I was in jail. He can interpret the dream. So Joseph is brought before Pharaoh, and Pharaoh says, and Joseph says, I can't do that, but God can interpret dreams. And then he says, and things unfold as God had revealed to Joseph. There are 7 bumpy years, and Joseph, who's now in charge of Egypt, other than only below Pharaoh, and he's set up like the first ever food bank. And 7 years they collect food, and then the 7 years of famine start. And eventually, at the verging on starvation, Jacob sends his sons to Egypt. Obviously, news of the food bank was out there. Except a slight difference to the musical, Benjamin doesn't go. So the first time they go, and Benjamin's not there. And Joseph sees them. They don't recognize Joseph. And one thing or other, he sends them all back, saying you've got to bring the other brother. But one, Simeon, I think, has to stay behind with Joseph. Then this time they all come back again. Eventually, much to Jacob's concern and worry that he would lose Benjamin. That's the other son of Rachel. Now the favoured son, and he's terrified that he will lose Benjamin. Then, in this kind of conversation, he's about to send them all off back to Canaan when actually Joseph got one of his attendants to actually plant the cup, but it's a minor detail. And in this moment where Benjamin is the one who's caught, Benjamin is the one who will have this sentence, probably what the brothers think of death, upon him. Jail for life at best. The brothers' hearts resonate with the pain that can cause their father. And Judah eventually comes forward and says, swap his place with mine. And then they are reunited. There is tears of joy. And then news goes back home to Jacob. So that's most of the story of Jacob, of Joseph. So have you ever heard the phrase, living the dream? And sometimes that can be a genuine thing, just having a great time living the dream. But sometimes that can also be a slightly sarcastic, you're having a tough time. How are you doing? I'm living the dream. And in the story of Joseph, he has these dreams, these different dreams at different points in the story or other people are having. And those original dreams Joseph has of the stars and of the sheaves of corn, Joseph thinks it's all about him. The brothers think it's all about them having to bow down. And Jacob thinks it's all about him and Rachel. Joseph's dreams were planted in this idea of power. Jacob's dreams of Rachel past were now wrapped in the life of Joseph. And the brothers' dreams were wrapped in having a better father, wrapped in removing Joseph. And all of their dreams fell apart. And yet somehow in the story of broken hopes and dreams of a broken family, God was working. And if you have in any way today broken dreams, I want to ask you, is God working? Joseph would be well in his rights to think he was forgotten. He was forgotten by his family when he was sold into slavery, forgotten by Potiphar when he was thrown into jail, forgotten by the cupbearer when he was released. Ultimately, he would have been well within his rights to think, I am forgotten by God. But in the midst of chapter 39, this kind of frames him just after he's been sold into slavery and then thrown into jail at the end of that chapter. It says in verse 2, the Lord was with Joseph. Verse 21, the Lord was with him. Verse 23, the Lord was with him. Do you feel forgotten by God? Do you feel forgotten by family, work, in the home, by friends? You are not forgotten by God. Jesus says, I will be with you always. It's a simple illustration that if you open a wedding album and you go through the photos of a wedding album, one person is not in any of the photos, but is there throughout the day. And that's the photographer. And whether you are aware he is there or not, God is in the midst of every scene of your life. So Joseph was not forgotten. But Joseph himself chooses to remember God. When Potiphar's wife approaches him, his reasons are, how could I sin against God? When the cupbearer and baker come to him, he points again to God. Do not the interpretations belong to God? When Pharaoh asks him for his dream to be interpreted, he says, I can't, but God can. When he has children, he names them in names that point towards God. And then in the key scene where he reunited with his brothers, in chapter 45, he says, but God sent me here ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So it was not you, Joseph saying to his brothers, that sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household and ruler of Egypt. Joseph chooses to remember what God has done, and he allows that to drive his decision of how he then treats his brothers. So if you are struggling, if you are finding your dreams in whichever way are shattered, you are not forgotten by God. But I would encourage you to remember God. And sometimes things don't happen as quickly as we want. But the story of Joseph is one that spanned, the bit we've listened to, 20 years. But it took 20 years for Joseph to be ready to be reunited. It took 20 years for the brothers to be ready to be reunited. And you notice in the story, when Jacob finds out, you'd almost expect him to go to the brothers, what? You sold him, you told me he died, but you don't see that at all. But it took 20 years for Jacob to be able to react in that way. But the dream that Joseph had, which he thought was about him, the brothers thought it was about them, and Jacob thought it was about him and Rachel. It's never about them, kind of. It was about God saving them all. It wasn't about individually. It was about them saving them physically and saving them as a family. And Joseph gets that at the end. The dreams in that moment in time were not just about them individually, but collectively. And as the story goes on, into Egypt and for the nation of Israel at that point and God's people. Somehow, in the midst of broken dreams, God was working through it all. God was bigger than their bad mistakes. God was saying, I have got you. God's grace was bigger than their wrong choices. And so, are you living the dream positively? Great. Well, know God is with you and choose to remember him. But are you living the dream negatively for whatever reason? You are not forgotten. Choose to remember God. Philip Yancey said this: faith is believing in advance what will only make sense in reverse. God is here with each of you. Any dream will do. Well, God has a plan for each of you. He is with you. Remember him. Let's pray. Dear God, we thank you that you promise to be with us always. And when things are hard, it's hard to see that sometimes. So help us to know that and to remember you. And when we don't understand what's going on, help us to trust that you are working in situations in ways we can't comprehend. And as we go through this coming week, as we approach Easter, as we remember what on the surface seemed like dreams were falling apart all over the place. Betrayals, denials, arrests, and death. You had a plan all along. And may we all, through this coming week, experience again your passion for each of us. Amen.